Hey, it's syndicated radio talk show host, author, singer Al Cole, welcoming you to another edition of People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. I come from CBS Radio. My shows are nationally syndicated, and I've helped pave the way to treating women, guys, too. Coming up, a guy that you're going to like, too, and you're going to like his handle, too, at Antwyn. Now, that's a difficult name. Antwyn. It's a different name, and we can even ask Antwyn when he starts to talk, where did he get that name? I think it's a public interest, human interest name there. Antwyn Price is his name, and he's written a very interesting book. I think you're going to grab onto this, people. Paradise in Ruins. All right, now, let's take it bit by bit here. Paradise, that's something we like to know about. On People of Distinction especially, a lot of the positive things that are going on. What's more positive than paradise? But it's in ruins. And that means that, well, there's something happening to paradise in our world that either we can control or we can't control. We don't want paradise to be in ruins. His book is about the Pacific Islands in World War II and how they were destroyed by the Japanese and U.S. forces as well. I've got a debt to pay here to paradise. I want you to stick around, people, because we can make this relevant to not only the history buffs, but also to you, the everyday people of our world, in the United States, around the world, for 21st century considerations as well. Because some of these Pacific Islands that were destroyed in World War II, they are not only some of the upcoming nations, but they are some of maybe part of the biggest economies in this planet now, including Australia. Get that, people. Now, how did it go from ruins back to paradise? See, Antwyn's going to tell us a little bit about that saga, too, so stick around. This is real human interest. You're going to love it. And his book is available on Amazon. And when he starts to talk, maybe he can tell us a few other places to order. Paradise in Ruins. And I will say, he was brought to us by ARP, Author Reputation Press. And if you've got a book you want to move, hey, they're your movers. Go to authorreputationpress.com. Antwyn, welcome to People of Distinction, and let's talk about it. How are you doing today?
Oh, well, I'm doing fine, very fine. Thank you for inviting me to your show.
Well, it's a pleasure. And you've written a book. Now, most people who have been to my show and they write a book on a certain topic, they've either lived that topic or somehow they've been brought to that topic through some sort of personal interest. So, start out with, what's your interest in the Pacific Islands in World War II that were destroyed by Japan and the USA? Did you have maybe a family member back then that lived in the Pacific Islands or that were in World War II and served? Or what was the interest in writing this book?
Well, that's a very good question. A couple of reasons. First of all, I grew up in the Pacific region and was born in Singapore. And then I lived in Dutch Java and afterwards in Canada. And then I spent the years of World War II as a schoolboy in Australia before moving to Texas and becoming a U.S. citizen. So the stories are not really memoirs, but certain events were based upon my personal experiences and those of friends and relatives. So it kind of was my part of the world when I was a young man.
Isn't that something? And, you know, it's notable that you mentioned Singapore. Singapore is one of the large economies these days in the world, particularly as far as individual income. It's really, it's bigger than the United States as far as personal income. And that was one of the islands that was partially destroyed anyway in World War II. Is that right?
That's correct. The Japanese occupied Singapore and Malaya and many islands around that right after Pearl Harbor happened in the U.S.
So tell us about that. Expand on some of the islands that were destroyed in World War II by the Japanese, and maybe even more particularly by U.S. forces. How was that? How was that done back then?
Well, the war had started in Europe the war against Germany in 1939. But the U.S. was basically neutral until Pearl Harbor was invaded by the Japanese fleet. And that was on December 7th, 1941, a date we commemorate all the time. But on the same day, on the other side of the international date line, it was December 8th, and the Japanese also invaded the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and so forth, to try to put out a great ring of buffer islands away from the Japanese mainland, knowing that the U.S. would eventually retaliate. Okay, so the paradise concept is that many of these islands had populations that were happily enjoying life, and all of a sudden they were caught up in this war, terrific war that they had no reason to participate in, and much of their infrastructure was destroyed as the Japanese occupied it. The U.S. was caught flat-footed, let's say, and wasn't really prepared for this conflict. But eventually they got rolling, and of course with our industrial might, we slowly pushed the Japanese back towards Japan. And in so doing, we chased them out of islands like Guam and the Philippines and Okinawa, and sort of did the people in again who had already been through quite a lot of inconvenience and loss of life. Mm-hmm. So here come the Americans to liberate them from the Japanese and practically destroyed them a second time. So that was a double whammy. And when the war ended, a lot of these countries that had been colonies of France or the Netherlands or the U.S. or Britain decided they wanted to fight for their own independence and become independent states. And during the next 10 years, all of them, the Philippines became a republic, Singapore became a republic, Malaya became Malaysia, Indochina, which was a French colony, became Vietnam, and the Dutch East Indies became Indonesia. So those are all independent countries today, and there were two catalysts that did that. The Japanese, when they occupied these islands, they promoted the concept of they wanted to help those people get rid of the Americans and the Brits and the French and so on, and in turn become part of the sphere of influence of Japan. But then the Americans arrived, and the American President Roosevelt was very anti-colonial stance anywhere in the world. So he really disseminated and reinforced the Japanese idea of independence for these nations, for these occupied colonies. So there was hope there, spread certainly by Roosevelt and the U.S. policies. And after the wars, all these nations that I've mentioned became independent republics. Some of them just by negotiation, and some of them had to fight very bitterly against their colonial occupiers. Vietnam was a good example of that, and so was Indonesia.
Absolutely. And after the war, after Roosevelt, came Truman, and I would think that there was a lot of aid given to these Pacific Islands as well to, recoup from World War II. Tell us a little bit about the aid that was given and how that helped these countries to recoup as well.
You're quite right there, and aid was given to our enemy, Japan. It was occupied by U.S. forces, but the U.S. spent a fortune there to rebuild Japan and rebuild Korea, which had been destroyed, just as they were doing in Europe, rebuilding Germany and Italy and so forth. So vast amounts of money were spent, and vast amounts of material was expended. So this was all, of course, to try to spread democracy around the world. Well, at the same time, Stalin and Russia had been a U.S. ally, but the minute World War II ended, the communist nations became our adversaries. So from Russia, communism spread to China, and from China there were subversive units in Malaya and in Vietnam and so forth. So that was the other party that was present after the war ended, were these brush fire insurgencies in all these islands again, trying yet again to take a different form of independence under the guise of communism.
Look at
so
that.
It was a very confusing world at that time.
And a very gripping topic here by our guest, Antwyn Price, and he wrote the book on it, Paradise in Ruins. We're talking about that on People of Distinction with Al Cole. If you want to order that book, you can order it at Amazon.com. And while we're on the topic here of Amazon and your name, Antwyn, human interest here, and then we'll get back into the book and the Pacific Islands and everything. But how'd you get the name Antwyn, which is a very, very distinctive and different sort of name? And Paradise in Ruins, is that also located on other venues besides Amazon?
Yeah, my real name is Anthony Price. And Antwyn Price is my author name, or nom de plume, as they're called.
Yeah. And
the reason I did that is because there was another author already publishing under the name Anthony Price. Well, by ancestry, I come from Wales originally, several generations back, and Antwyn's sort of a Welsh version of Anthony.
You like that.
So there you have it.
And with your book, Paradise in Ruins, Amazon, of course, are there other places that people can order the book if they want?
Oh, yes. Barnes & Noble and AB Books, most booksellers will have it.
Yeah, we like
both
that.
Both in the U.S. and abroad.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question here, Antwyn, that my listeners would want to ask. We're a lot more sophisticated, I think the public is, than they might have been back in the 50s and into the 60s, and then they became very sophisticated again with the Vietnam War and everything, which really does apply to your book in an ancillary way for, later on, Vietnam, as you had mentioned earlier. Now, sophistication that I'm defining is, we know what's really going on here, Al. It's a money game, all of that stuff. And a lot of my listeners, when I get emails, Al, we want to find out more about what's going on really with our world and maybe with the financial aid that's going out. During that particular time, maybe people were saying, well, yeah, we helped to destroy Japan, so it's our obligation to help them rebuild. We helped to destroy Pacific Islands. It's our obligation to help them rebuild. But behind the scenes, there were high financiers who were profiting from this, and maybe, in the course of the quote-unquote aid, they were setting up shop in these countries and building, their buildings there and doing a lot of business there with the local denizens and making huge profits for American companies as well. Now, is that a consideration, too, in the aid that was given to, not so much Japan, certainly, Japan, but in the Pacific Islands, and later on, Vietnam? Yeah.
Sure. Originally, when the islands were colonies of the Europeans, such as the British, the French, and the Dutch, and the U.S., actually, why did the colonies exist? They were sources of raw materials, and they were exploited really for mining and for growing rubber and things like that had a big market value. And so that's what they were looked at, and the native people there were sort of treated as second-class citizens by the occupiers. And after the war ended, then the people who had been the owners of the colonies tried to get their colonies back again, and they were resisted because the colonies, of course, had eyes of becoming an independent and going up market in the value-added chain. But today there are trading partners. You mentioned Singapore. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and it's a tiny little place.
Yeah.
But it's become a financial center, such as Hong Kong.
Absolutely.
And the financial aspect of the Pacific area is absolutely phenomenal right now today. But we are now facing what will become our real adversary in future, which is China.
Mm-hmm.
And China has has come into the modern world through becoming the supplier of many things that we in the United States consume in our everyday lives. We gave them inadvertently the technology to become a rival, a massive rival, and they're going to be one of the most powerful countries in the world in this century.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, when we're talking about Asia, and we are primarily here with the Pacific Islands, and now Asia has become more and more an economic force, a political force, maybe even some sort of military force with China, potentially. This is really stunning. And we've all been through, most of our listeners anyway, know about times where they knew they were living through the Vietnam War. And it's all Asia here that we're talking about, except for one big exception. And maybe this isn't the only exception, but this is the biggest exception, Australia. Australia is part of the Pacific Islands that you were talking about that was also destroyed. And we'll get into, when we cap off the show, get a little bit more into Singapore as well. I think my listeners would be very interested in that. But how did Australia get destroyed too? And what made Australia? Australia was not Asian. Australia is, kind of a lot like the United States and certainly Great Britain and all of that stuff. How did Australia get into this destroyed play here?
You might say Australia is analogous to the United States. The U.S. was a British colony at one point, right? And so was Australia. Well, before the war started, Australia had become a commonwealth. In other words, it had gotten its independence, but it was associated with the British Empire. So it was not actually invaded by the Japanese, although they had a plan to do that. It became the base for General MacArthur when he was rallying the U.S. Army to retake the Philippines and so forth. And so it was bombed. The north part of Australia was bombed by the Japanese around Darwin, but it actually came out unscathed. And today Australia is a very powerful nation. But it isn't. You're right. It's not really in Asia. So they call this part of the world Asia Pacific. So the Asian mainland is China and Korea and so on and so forth, Japan. And then the Pacific Ocean has lots and lots of little islands in it and a few big continents like Australia and New Zealand.
Mm-hmm. Isn't something?
So there is an association today called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Mm-hmm. That's ASEAN. And it's an alliance of all the Taiwans and the Koreas and Indonesia and so forth. Most of the smaller nations out there belong to this, and that's helping them all bootstrap up and become modern nations.
Yeah, look at that. Hey, people, this is really stunning stuff. You want to order the book? It's called Paradise in Ruins. Our special guest here on People of Distinction, Antwyn Price, wrote the book, and it's available to you on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, a lot of other places too. Have some minutes left in the show, and you're giving great information to my listeners here, Antwyn. I want to take it out with a couple of things, starting with Singapore. I have associates, actually, who are in Singapore, and they're doing very, very well. They give me the reports of how well Singapore is doing. Very quickly, within a 2-minute time frame, tell us how Singapore went from being destroyed in World War II to the real economic powerhouse that it is now.
Well, a lot of it was due to one particular man. He was Singapore's president in its early independence. His name was Lee Kuan Yew. He's a famous man. He was a bit of a fussy leader, but he was brilliant. And he was basically an offshore Chinese. His family were Hakka Chinese that had come to Singapore some generations before. And he was authoritarian figure, as many were in those days. His famous story about him is he banned chewing gum from Singapore because he sat on a blob of it and it stuck to his trousers. And today, his son is the president, or the prime minister, rather, of Singapore. Well, anyway, hard work and crafty alliances. He led the country from being a shattered mess back into a leading light in the world. And, of course, Singapore is too small to really be a powerhouse. It does have a very powerful armed forces, though, which was trained by Israelis, really? And they did their maneuvers in Taiwan, with the mountains of Taiwan, and so on. And a very pragmatic thing that Singapore has done lately, there was a former British naval base there. And Singapore has, after it became independent, it inherited the naval base, and it was a shipyard for a while. But what they've done now is they've made it a refueling station for the U.S. 7th Fleet. So here they are, a seemingly very peaceful nation, very cleverly having the U.S. Navy to defend it. No one's going to mess with Singapore while the U.S. fleet is coming and going there.
Wow, a lot going on.
That's an example of their smarts.
Yes, absolutely. Asian smarts, too. And we're going to cap it off with a little bit of that. The Asian smarts and where Asia, these Pacific Islands, are going from this point on. Possibility thinking here, Antwyn. I end all of my shows with possibility thinking. It's a way to encapsulate both the information, and we've gotten a lot of that from you, as well as the inspiration of anything that my guest talked about in terms of what some of the things my guests were talking about came to pass big time in our world at some point in the future. What kind of world would that look like? And I'm going to put the focus back where you put it in Paradise and Ruins, the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Islands, and we already know about Singapore and some of the other, Indonesia, gaining traction, but certainly Singapore. And then we know about China, not necessarily part of the Pacific Islands, and Taiwan, and the Asian countries particularly. What do you see possibility-wise on the future since World War II, and then go another 50 years into the future, maybe even just 20 years into the future? Are the Asian countries going to be the big prominent countries of the world in 20 years, do you think?
Well, I think they'll certainly be one of the axes of the world, as Europe will probably be another one, and the U.S. in between, perhaps maintaining relationships with both. We still have some unresolved problems, though, in the Asia-Pacific. We have North and South Korea. What's going to happen there is anybody's guess. Mm-hmm. But there was at one time North and South Vietnam, and the northern communist part prevailed. And today in Korea, it's a standoff between the South, supported by the U.S., and the North, supported by China and Russia. So that could go either way. And it's one of those things that has to get resolved before the entire area is peaceful and prosperous and cooperative. But without even that being resolved, China obviously has the capability to produce anything that it wants to. Mm-hmm. It's educating its citizens. Many Chinese students go abroad to the U.S. and to Europe to study, and all of this brings back know-how, and with that know-how comes prosperity. Mm-hmm. So I see the Asia-Pacific being a real part of the world that all of us need to get to know. We need to learn their languages, just as they've learned ours, and exchange students and remain friendly with them and cooperative.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And, I'm going to add a couple of cents to the great sense that Antwyn was just making in possibility thinking, and throughout this show. Goes out to you, my listening audience, to cap off this great exposition of people of distinction today with Antwyn Price. We have to learn to honor all citizens of the world. We're born the same way. We go out the same way. We're all born babies. And this is people of distinction talk right now to you, my listening audience, who really are the people of distinction of our world. That baby comes out and says, wow, I'm here. I made it. I'm alive. Greatest blessing in the world is just to be alive at all, people. And that is a blessing that we all share, no matter where we live on this planet. And more in our contemporary world, we're understanding that we do have more in common than we have in difference. The internet has brought that in, and millennials, probably the least prejudiced generation of all time. And if we continue that into our future, we have to win, because we tap into some of the greatest genius that we can all over the place. And Asia has traditionally been one of those places anyway, with the culture. Eastern culture, and there are many people who honor Eastern culture and Taoistic backgrounds, Buddhistic backgrounds, and things along that line. Very, very dedicated and resilient people. And it was a tragedy to have the Pacific Islands so destroyed by Japan and also the United States in World War II. But look how far we've come, and look, where we can go into the future. Tapping into some of the resources of people who have been resilient, who have said, hey, this ain't the end. It ain't over till it's over. And even after that, boy, we're still going to be fighting for our human rights and for the dignity of our human family. See, that's what it's all about here on People of Distinction. And no matter who comes to People of Distinction, we always cap it off with something along that line. And it's easy with Antwyn. Antwyn is a guy who was brought up, he said in Singapore, lived in Singapore for many, many years, understands the Pacific Islands, even though he also has roots in, other areas, the western areas of the world as well. He is holistic in that way, a citizen of the world. And we like that on People of Distinction with Al Cole. And if you like it too, well, order that book, Paradise in Ruins. And it's all about the Pacific Islands in World War II, destroyed by Japan and the USA. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, a whole bunch of other places. And I will say, he was brought to us by ARP, Author Reputation Press. And if you got a book you want to move, hey, they're your movers. Go to authorreputationpress.com. Thank you so much, Antwyn, for being my special guest today on People of Distinction. We wish you all the best with your book and with your life directions. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Antwyn.
Thank you, too, Al. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. I really like your philosophy. Oh, that was great. We could have gone on for hours.
Yeah, absolutely.